Welcome to Endurance Podcast. We keep talking about how the potential membership of Finland and Sweden in NATO and ongoing war in Ukraine affects security of the Nordic countries. Today our guest is Tor Bukkvoll, Senior Research Fellow at the Norwegian Defence Research Establishment. Mr. Bukkvoll, what the Ukraine's armed forces experience in the war with Russia after February 24 is relevant for Norway. Is there any need to revise Norway's defense doctrine in connection with the war in Ukraine?
Yeah, those are two questions, and I will have to answer yes to the first and no to the second. In terms of the first question, it's obvious that what you're doing and what you've been doing very successfully so far is not only interesting, but also a great inspiration, obviously, for armed forces in many other countries, including ours. So I'm sure that already our society or our armed forces are already studying what's going on, the experiences you have, and I'm sure that will continue also after the war is finished. At the same time, it's important always to know that no war is like the previous one. So if we study your experiences with an understanding that this is now how Russia fights and this is now how Russia should be counted, then we'll be on the wrong track because all wars are different. So I guess that most of the lessons that we can take from the Ukrainian experience are maybe mostly on the tactical level, maybe also to some extent on the operational level. So just a couple of examples would be that this fight has definitely demonstrated the utility of air defense. This is not something new. I mean, we all know when in Norway, we also knew that air defense is important. But I can imagine that in terms of priorities, for example, in what the Norwegian armed forces should buy in the future, what has happened in Ukraine may be used as an argument for those who think that air defense should have a higher priority than some other systems. So that's an example of how a lesson from this war can be transformed. Another thing that I've been thinking about quite a lot is, well, based on the experience of Bucha, Irpin, and other places, especially around Kyiv, but not only around Kyiv, but also in other areas of Ukraine, is how much have we in Norway thought about the fate of the civilian population in areas under occupation? And I think that's, although again, if something happened in our area, that could be entirely different from what's happened in Ukraine. Still, I think what happened in those cities has shocked the whole world, and us included. Maybe it shouldn't have shocked us because we know things that happened in Chechnya. We know details of the Russian warfare in Syria, but still what happened in those cities and other cities has made an impression. And I think that in planning for the future, we need to take more into consideration the fate of the civilian population in occupied areas. So those will be just two examples on how the warfare in Ukraine may have an impact also here. But then you ask about the defense doctrine as such, and I don't see any reason to change that at the moment, because I think basically other things, like the things we're going to talk about later in this conversation, will have more to say for the Norwegian defense doctrine than the war in Ukraine.
How Norwegian society perceive NATO enlargement in the north? And let me ask this, given that relations with Russia steadily degrade, what does potential Finnish and Swedish NATO membership mean for Norwegian security?
Let me respond to the first part of your question first about how the potential membership of Sweden and Finland is viewed in Norway. And I would have to say extremely positive. So the current government is very clearly in favor and has said this from the beginning when the question came up. The parliament is in favor, all parties in parliament except the far left party, and their arguments are not really so much against Sweden and Finland joining as they are against NATO as such. So I think it's more for that party and also others who oppose this is more a criticism on NATO as an organization than it is about Finnish and Swedish membership. And the population, or the opinion polls in the population, show that about 80% of Norwegians support Finnish and Swedish membership in NATO. So that's definitely very positive. There is an understanding, of course, that this may provoke Russia. Russia has also been very clear that they see this as a very negative development for them. But that fact has not really had a huge impact on the Norwegian populations. That doesn't mean that there won't be, not necessarily problems, but things will change for Norway if this happens. So one thing, for example, could be that when Norwegians think about Russia, we normally think about the Arctic and the Barents Sea. When Finns and Swedes think about Russia, they think about the Baltic. So you could see in terms of attention that there will be somewhat of a shift from the Arctic and to the Baltic. And that's not necessarily in Norwegian interest, but it might be in Swedish and Finnish interest. Now, more attention to the Baltic doesn't necessarily mean less attention to the Arctic, but there could be issues that would have to be resolved there. Of course, the Arctic will still be important for the Americans and for the Brits and others because of the Northern Fleet and because of the nuclear submarines at the Kola Peninsula. But still, that's an issue that could come up. Another one is that Norway, since the Second World War, has been NATO in the north. So that's been our identity, and we've been kind of having some kind of almost monopoly on that position, which means that when there have been issues of Russia and the High North, then the Norwegian voice has been strong. We may now have to compete a little bit more with the Swedes and the Finns in that regard, or not necessarily compete, but coordinate our approaches more than we did in the future. So overall, I will say that the opinion is very, very positive.
For years, Oslo was capable to maintain stable and predictable bilateral relations with the Kremlin. From one perspective, Norway took an active role in British-led coalition Joint Expeditionary Force since 2014. On the other hand, your country provided nuclear security cooperation with Russia and spent a big amount of money for that purpose. Now it is obviously that potential accession of Sweden and Finland to NATO is likely to provoke nervous reaction from Moscow. So let's predict something about that, how things will go on, whether Russia has leverage to blackmail Norway.
In terms of the cooperation with the Brits and the Swedes and the Finns and the hammer of NATO in the north, as you said, I think that will work out quite well. We have a very good cooperation with the Brits from before, and we'll definitely find solutions that will satisfy everybody in that respect. When it concerns the nuclear cooperation with the Russians in the north, that was a success for a long time, I would say. We spent a lot of money on it, that's right, but I think it was to the mutual advantage of both Russia and Norway, and it was part of a much bigger attempt to create cooperation in the High North. So we, in addition to the Arctic Council, for example, we also have the Barents Sea cooperation, which was launched in the early 90s and which contained not only cooperation on getting rid of all the nuclear fuels, but a lot of other things as well. I mean, in general, we had an agenda with Russia in the High North from the early 1990s, and I would say more or less until the annexation of Crimea in 2014. It gradually became more difficult as the Putin regime became much more, gradually more autocratic, but we maintained that until, I would say, 2014, and parts of it also continued after 2014, but that was very difficult. Now it's more or less closed, and one of the main architects of cooperation with Russia in the High North just said the other day that he now thinks this cooperation is dead, more or less. That's very sad, but then it's sad. Everything that's happened to Russia in the last 10-15 years is sad, so it's just part of the general tendency. Going back to the nuclear issue, whether Russia could use that as a blackmail, I don't really see that. It's more that the cooperation has shut down. It was never easy, and it just became more and more complicated, but then it did have some success in the beginning. Now it's very difficult to have most kinds of cooperation, but we still have some. So for example, we still have a cooperation with the Russians in the management of the fish stocks in the Barents Sea. That has been obviously an advantage to both countries, and I see that to continue. There is also some cooperation on search and rescue at sea. So some areas like that will probably continue, but with the war in Ukraine and with everything that has happened, it won't be much more than that. At the same time, I think the general view in Norway is still that Russia is not interested in conflict in the Arctic as such. I mean, they fear a competition with NATO in the Arctic. There's a military buildup from the Russian side, and also more NATO military activity. But borders in the Arctic are more or less clear, also at sea. And I don't think Russia currently, at least, needs any more conflicts. I mean, they are struggling to take Donbass with the conventional forces that they have. So I don't think they are in need of more military conflicts in other parts of the country.
Mr. Bukkvoll, it would be interesting to talk about the future of the Arctic Council. What are the security implications, especially in terms of ecology, for the High North region, given that Russia faces with international isolation?
First of all, it's important to establish that the Arctic Council does not deal with security affairs. So it's mostly about ecological issues, as you said, and then ecological and environmental issues in a broad sense. So it's also about the populations living in the north. But currently the situation is, as you alluded to, that the Arctic Council stopped working when the war started. Then relatively recently, I think already on the 3rd of March, or at least in the beginning of March, the Arctic Council re-established, but without Russia. So now there is an Arctic Council, but it's the 7 other countries. So Russia was basically just ignored because of what they're doing in Ukraine. And Russia, of course, protested strongly against this, but that's the way it is at the moment. And that's the way it's going to be for a long time, I think. But I do think you have a point that it's not really possible to have an efficient, also ecological and environmental cooperation in the High North without Russia. So this means that that cooperation will suffer. It's very bad, but it will suffer until there is another Russia, I guess. I mean, nobody knows when and how this war is going to end, but it's going to end sometime. And we also don't know at the moment what kind of Russia we will have after the war. We may have a Russia very much like today, or we may have a somewhat different Russia. We may even have a much more difficult Russia than we already have. But there are also possibilities, at least in the longer run, that we may have a somewhat more positive Russia. So the future of the Arctic Council will almost totally, I guess, depend on that. I just wanted to add that this is not really about the Arctic Council, but it's a little bit back to what I said before in terms of the membership of Sweden and Finland in NATO, that at least when it comes to Norway and our security, what really changes here, and I think this is important to understand because this is one of the main reasons why membership for those countries is seen so positively in Norway, is that we felt from the Second World War until now relatively alone with Russia in the High North. Especially, I think we were afraid that if it should come to some kind of conflict, Russia might be tempted to use a limited amount of force to create a fait accompli on the ground that we couldn't prevent, and do that before Allied reinforcements came. Because we have our allies, the Brits, the Americans, and all the others in NATO. But at least for the Americans, it's a long way across the sea to Norway. So there would be an extended period of time from hostilities started until we would have reinforcements. And we are 5.5 million people in Norway, so it's a small country, and our armed forces are also, because of that, not very big. So we feared that Russia could think that if they just did this fast enough, then they would succeed and they would be able to prevent a further big NATO operation. Now, if Sweden and Finland join NATO, that will change, because instead of being faced with a small population of 5.5 million, Russia would be faced with a region of 20 million people. So both in terms of deterrence against Russia for doing anything in the high north, and in terms of actual fighting if things should go wrong, we think would be in a much stronger position if Finland and Sweden join NATO. So this is going to change a lot for us.